Good evening, everyone. I'm, as Giles said, Phil Mason. I'm the Head of Regulatory Engagement with Trustmark. Something I had actually forgotten about is I think my grandma was rather further ahead of her time than anybody in my family would have given her credit for, because she lined her poodle's dog's bed with rockwool in about 1973. Yeah, I know. Just an interesting concept, I suppose. So, let me just find my starting point. I want to do a little bit of scene setting, if I may. One thing I want to ask is, or I just need to confirm really, is everybody in the room reasonably familiar with the term retrofit? We must be. Okay. So another thing, this might be a slightly braver thing to ask, is everybody or anybody or some of you in the room familiar with Trustmark and its brief, at least have heard of it or maybe understand something about it? Could you just give me sort of some indicator, a nod or a yes or a no? Okay. So my role this evening isn't to educate you about Trustmark, although there is a little bit about what Trustmark does, but I want to do some scene setting, and I'm going to start with this. And I don't know if you can see those numbers directly at the back in the bottom corner there. Depending who you listen to, we've got about 28.3 million homes in this country. Now, you would think we'd know probably rather closely down to the last sort of few hundred, really, how many homes we've got, but that seems to be a reasonable number, no matter how you sort of cross-examine it, really. And surprisingly, 24 million homes of those 28.3 require retrofit. So there are houses being built today that will require retrofit going forward because they're built to an older standard. And we all know how building regulations work. It's not a criticism of it, it's just a fact. So there is a house being finished off this evening, being handed over, that will require retrofit as we go forward. And there's an interesting figure there that I can't always remember, so I write it on the back of my hand because I'm going to reference it a little bit later on. 2,267 properties will require retrofitting per day for 365 days a year. So that's no stop for Christmas, no stop for Easter, no stop for wedding anniversaries or birthdays or anything like that. We just work through. Naturally, I'm saying that rather tongue-in-cheek, but it's to indicate what needs to be done over 29 years. Now, I don't think we retrofitted 2,267 dwellings yesterday. I don't think we did that today, and I don't think we're going to do that tomorrow. So the market isn't reducing. The challenge and the opportunity remains, and it is absolutely enormous. Admittedly, some of these dwellings, some of the more modern dwellings will require shallow retrofit. Some of the older traditional building stock that we've got across the UK will require deep retrofit, which is extensive. I live in an old Victorian home. We've started its journey of retrofit. There's a lot more to do. So there is an enormous opportunity, but it does represent a challenge, and it depends what you look at, how you look at it, whether you see it as challenge or whether you see it as opportunity. Realistically, I think it's probably both. Just to put some context on it, I'm not sure how well those numbers sort of translate to the back of the room. The cerise colour, the cerise colour there represents the carbon emissions from the UK in 2019 related to dwellings, so it's 30%. 23%, almost a quarter of our carbon dioxide emissions in the UK relate to heating buildings, which is something that I think is close to all of us. It's close to what we do, and it's close to why we sit here. So that puts it in some sort of context, not only the numbers and the volume over the time, but the percentage of what happens in the UK, what's needed to be done across the UK. So have we all heard of the heating building strategy? Is that a murmur? So the heating building strategy is something that was published by the government. I'm not here from any political stance over it. There are observers and bystanders that make various comments about it over the last few weeks. They've pulled out the strengths of it, the weaknesses of it, and those are personal opinions, so I don't have a political view around it. It's just, it is what it is. So, Giles, are these slides able to be circulated? Is there any intention will they be posted somewhere? Because I've put a few links in. I know we can all search the internet and put the name in, but there's a few direct links where you can go in and find certain pieces of information after the event, because I'm sure at the volume of what I've got to say and the pace I say it, it's going to raise a number of questions. So I'm here until the end of the evening, or for as long as I can. Lila, our head of comms, is there, so we're here if you need to ask questions about Trustmark or about the things that we're talking about that I'll speak about. Approach us and ask about them. There's some interesting conversations. So there are some critics that say, well, all it does is recycles existing policy, which isn't quite correct. You can't throw existing policies out that the government have created. So it captures the existing and it builds on new. And I'll talk to you a little bit about new, about some of the opportunities and some of the volumes of cash that are being pumped into our sector. And it's very, very substantial. There's almost 250,000 skilled jobs to be created. Now that number varies depending, again, who you talk to and in what context. So because I'm from Trustmark and predominantly we register the installers that carry out work, and more recently what we call retrofit assessors and retrofit coordinators, I tend to only think about the installation supply chain, which is probably rather naive and probably rather narrow of me for an event like this, because absolutely, of course, it includes manufacturing, and it also includes merchants, because we have to get the products into the supply chain. There has to be a network to distribute it, and it's something we're all familiar with, but there's huge opportunity for expansion within this. A joint endeavour across the UK is defined at fairly high level within the heating building strategy, because we have to treat it as a UK, but there's different challenges through the property archetypes in Cornwall. You're going to hear a little bit from Andy Sutton from Cerro, that I'm pleased to say that I know reasonably well. He's a fellow that's got sort of 1 3/4 eyes on the future of what's happening in Wales, and he'll explain a little bit about the initiative and the volume of work that's being done there. Wales brings another challenge. It's got an old housing stock. Some of it is in relatively poor condition. You go to the west coast of Wales, or you might go to the west coast of Scotland, and you've got different weather conditions, you've got different environmental conditions, you've got wind exposure, you've got wind-driven rain that penetrates properties. So if we fill all of those with cavity wall insulation without treating the dwellings in the first instance to make them watertight, we got wet cavity wall insulation. Some dwellings may not be suitable for that type of measure to be installed. So there's a whole approach across the UK, and it's related specifically to the type of dwelling. We talk a lot about the fabric first approach, the fabric first whole house approach. What it's about doing is securing the building envelope to retain heat, so that we need to put less energy into that dwelling to warm it, so that at the point of use we can reduce carbon emission locally, but we need to take the demand from the grid down, because in producing energy to put it into the grid, we're making carbon emission. We're making carbon, so it's about fabric first to retain heat or reduce the demand into dwellings, and it's quite a sensible approach. So this little document that Giles was kind enough to speak about earlier, some of you will have had some on the way in. If you didn't, there's some at the back and there's some over there, still at the front in boxes. But it's about really trying to give a simple explanation about what retrofit is, to talk a little bit about fabric first, and talk about something that some of you may have heard of. If you haven't currently, you will in the not too distant future, about something called PAS 2035, which is a standard that was released about 2.5 years ago, and it's around the process that we need to follow in the UK in order to put the right measures into the right dwellings and in the right order. Because if you get it out of context, or you do it in the wrong order, or we do it as a nation in the wrong order, what we've actually got is we're going to have to undo certain things and spend additional money on it. So it's about being efficient, and it's about protecting the property, and it's about respecting the householder's wishes as well. 2035, we'll see no gas-fired boilers, which is peculiar to me because I'm from the gas industry. So I've come from an industry that just wants to burn things, and the gas industry is fairly well positioned technically in order to move into new technologies. So I don't think there's any problems there. There are some voluntary targets put into the heat and building strategy around mortgage lenders' portfolios, about bringing them to EPC Band C by 2030. If there isn't enough progress in that arena, then they may become mandatory targets. And then finally, for that slide, I'll talk in a little bit about how low-income households will be funded through the government to make improvements. But I would say most, if not all of us are in this room, may not have eligibility under those taxpayer-funded government schemes. So we'll need to think about how we're going to fund it. So we need some innovation. Excuse me. We need some incentive in order to be able to fund what we need to do in our own homes. One thing I would just say, that's a 202-page document. I've read it. I can't remember it all. So just what I'm saying here are the points that I'm drawing out that I think are probably most interest to us because of the sector we're involved with. But it's worth downloading a copy, and it's worth just having a scan read of it, and the areas that of more interest to you in depth to see what it's setting out. But it is fairly high level. It now remains for the sector and our industries to actually to engage with government to engage backwards, to bring these things to life and make it happen. Okay, from next April, these are just some figures. I won't read them all out because it's just more numbers. There is a £450 million boiler upgrade scheme being launched next April. And when we talk about boiler upgrade, it's about supporting people with up to £5,000 worth of grant money to help them change from their existing fossil fuel boiler systems or whatever mechanism they use to heat their homes, in order to encourage people to start taking up heat pumps and understanding more about heat pumps. So there's a substantial fund, £60 million, so that we can make heat pumps probably more attractive, easier to install, make them more acceptable to a consumer, because it's a different technology that not everybody is understanding and not everybody is fully engaged with, but it's seen as perhaps not the panacea, but heat pumps work well in a lot of dwellings. They will work well in more dwellings when we can treat the fabric. So it's about getting us as a nation to start to change our approach about how we heat our dwellings. There's some other things in here. The Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, which is, as it says, is aimed at social housing decarbonisation. There's a large increase there. HUG, I like that word because it's sort of HUG, isn't it? Which is the Home Upgrade Grant. Phase 1 of the Home Upgrade Grant was £150 million. You can see how far that's now been extended to £950 million in its initiative to help low-income families that live in off-gas grid houses, to enable them to be able to move forward and decarbonise their homes. The public sector decarbonisation, schools and hospitals, there's money in there. Something that we talk about here as heat networks, I know as district heating systems. I used to watch quite interesting films, that might be just me of course, where large tower blocks used to incinerate their waste because it used to start to heat the tower block. So we can't raw incinerate waste anymore. That has a negative effect, but the concept is probably one that we might think we might attach more to the condominium sort of style of living in perhaps America or Australia, where you have central heat sources that bring economies of scale so that you can heat more buildings. It's just a different style of heating dwellings. So where does Trustmark fit in? Trustmark is cited in regulation under the energy company obligation, where energy companies improve the dwellings of people that are in fuel poverty or struggling to heat their homes. We're a requirement through the local authority delivery scheme, which is spending government, taxpayer money, but through government directed schemes. Sustainable Warmth, the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, and the Warm Homes Discount. So they are about helping low-income families to heat their homes, and Trustmark is a requirement to maintain the standards. So I've spoken a little bit past 2035. There's a little bit in there if you want to learn some more about the process of how that works, and you will hear more about it. And those works are lodged into the Trustmark data warehouse so that we can carry out a quality assurance function behind it to establish that works are carried out to the right standard. But there's a very important function of the data warehouse that is something for the sort of short-term future, about property passporting or property logbooks, so that we can see the dwellings, we can see who's done what and how they're financially protected in case there's an issue, and so that we can see the journey of those dwellings to see how far they've got to go yet to reach net zero. Right, a national retrofit strategy. The Construction Leadership Council in June published a strategy to support government thinking around how we may get to net zero through retrofit. I haven't done a mapping exercise, but being fairly familiar with the heating building strategy and the national retrofit strategy, they tend to mesh fairly well. And again, that's a document that's very, very well supported by sectors of industry, and it's worth looking at because there's milestones in it about how we're going to achieve it, about the numbers of tradespeople, about what we're going to need in terms of supplies to be able to deliver all of this fabulous opportunity. I won't dwell too long on it, but any strategy needs component parts of it. So it's about leadership, that which has been, and communication, which has sort of been measured really against the Olympics campaign. I think that was 2012, if my memory's right, about how we rolled that out into the UK and got people interested and engaged. So there's some lessons learned from just simple, well, when I say simple, probably by comparison, simple exercises about performance standards. Are the projects that are being carried out, are they meeting their objectives? And something that's obviously fairly close to Trustmark is point number 8, which is about compliance and quality. We can't get 5 million dwellings in and finding out that the quality of delivery isn't adequate, because that just wouldn't be right. Finally, I'm going to very, very briefly, because I don't wish to set myself up as an expert on COP26, this 1.5 degrees C alive agreement that's been made is so important to us. 1.5 degrees doesn't seem very much, but I think if you convert that to Fahrenheit, I think we've probably got to be of a certain age, probably my age, to think more about Fahrenheit. I think that's almost 35 degrees Fahrenheit, which sounds a bit of a bigger thing, doesn't it? If we don't do that currently, we're on track for global warming of 2.7 degrees C beyond pre-industrialisation levels, which, if I remember history reasonably well, was the sort of middle 1800s. If we get as far as 2 degrees, let alone 2.7, that's a death sentence for certain regions in certain continents. You saw the pictures that Giles was kind of to show us earlier about the flooding, the sustained heat waves that we'll have, the impact that'll have on humanity, the impact that'll have on being able to grow food and being able to produce supplies for ourselves. So again, I've got no political allegiance, I'm just concerned about what happens. So again, there's a document there, I've put a link in there, that it might be worth just having a look to see what COP26 actually means at very, very high level. I can't do something like that justice in the time that we've got, and we've got more things to do in the evening, and across the evening. And something that is really critical, and I think we've probably all heard this, there was initially conversation about phasing out fossil fuel. It's turned into phase down, but we would really struggle to meet that 1.5 degrees requirement if we continue to keep burning coal and keep burning things. So it's very poignant, I think, and I think we need to see that as top level. Heating building strategy is something that's closer to us here, and if we look at the Construction Leadership Council document, that gives us some milestones and an approach that we might be able to take. So I have gone over, apologies there, because I know that I'm going to get my knuckles wrapped quite rightly. So I'm going to stop and I'm going to hand over to Andy. So thank you for listening to me.